"I'm not supposed to talk to you," he said flatly. "Dad says you're just some old lady." I didn't know which part hurt more, his words or how naturally they came out of his mouth. I stood there in my good shoes, the ones I only wore to church, or when something mattered. In my hands was the sweater I had knitted for him. Green, his favorite color when he was little. I had even stitched his initials onto the inside hem, thinking maybe he'd smile at that. He didn't even look at it. It was his 10th birthday. I hadn't been invited, but I came anyway. I waited by the porch, not wanting to interrupt, just hoping someone might notice. Nolan stepped out first, surprised. Then came Desiree, her mouth tightened when she saw me. "You should go," she said under her breath. "We talked about this." Then Jonah appeared behind them, face full of cake and curiosity. I bent slightly, offering the sweater, the way I used to offer cookies when he scraped his knee. He didn't move. That's when he said it. Those words I'll never forget. I left before the candles went out. The days after felt longer than usual. I folded the sweater and placed it in the bottom drawer next to his old drawings and the wooden train we built together when he was 5. Then came the silence. No calls, no updates, no surprise visits to my porch like he used to do. I still baked on Saturdays out of habit more than hope. I still looked out the window when the school bus passed, knowing full well he wouldn't be there. A part of me wanted to knock again to demand to be heard. But another part, the part that remembered the look in his eyes, knew that wouldn't change anything. I stopped setting out the extra plate at dinner. I stopped reaching for the phone. I told myself I was fine. But when I walked past his empty chair the next morning, I couldn't help but pause. The plate went back into the cabinet. I had washed it, dried it, and held it in my hand for a moment, just long enough to remember how he used to pick the peas off it, one by one. Then I placed it gently on the shelf. No more second setting. No more folding napkins into stars he'd never see. No more glancing at the clock at 3 p.m., wondering if I'd hear the screech of school bus brakes near the corner. I kept baking for a while. Banana bread mostly. He liked the crusty ends. But without the small fingers to steal them off the tray, they just hardened on the counter until I threw them out. The house itself didn't change. The creaky stair still creaked. The lamp in the living room still buzzed when turned on too fast. But it felt quieter, like the walls had decided to stop trying too. I texted Nolan once a week. Nothing demanding, just updates. Got my flu shot today. The maple tree's turning early this year. Thinking of you. He never responded. Desiree had never liked me, that I knew. But I thought I could earn her kindness. I thought that raising Nolan on my own would count for something, that there'd be some recognition, some respect. But it wasn't anger that filled the house. It was something slower, a hollowing. I'd never imagined what it would feel like to still be alive and yet be erased from someone's picture. At the church rummage sale, someone pointed to an old puzzle and said, "Perfect for grandkids." I smiled, nodded. I didn't mention the drawer in my house that still held Jonah's baby blanket. That evening, I sat in my armchair, untouched tea on the table, and stared at the empty dining chair across from me. It had once been his favorite, closer to the kitchen, closer to the cookies. But now it was just part of the furniture. And still, every time I passed it, I hesitated. Just enough to look toward the window. I was reaching for oranges when I saw him. Jonah. A little taller, maybe, wearing a red jacket I didn't recognize. He was walking beside Desiree, who was talking into her phone with the usual tilt of her chin, like the world was beneath her. He didn't see me at first, but then his eyes drifted upward, and we locked eyes across the produce section. I smiled. I gave a small wave. For half a second he didn't move, then slowly, almost deliberately, he turned his head away. "Keep walking," Desiree said loud enough that I didn't have to guess what she meant. I stood there holding an orange in midair, my hand cold and still. They passed me, and he didn't look back. I placed the orange in my cart and left, without buying anything else. That night, I didn't eat dinner, just sat in the kitchen listening to the clock and thinking about how quickly a child can unlearn the sound of your voice. But a few days later, my neighbor Eleanor knocked on my door with a bag of lemons and a story. I saw Jonah the other day, she said, already setting the lemons on my counter. He was behind the bakery, crouched down with something in his coat. I looked up. A kitten, she added. Scrawny little thing. Looked like he'd pulled it from a drain pipe. He was shielding it from the wind, like it was the only thing he had in the world. I nodded, unsure what to do with the image she had just planted in my chest. He didn't see me, she added, but I could tell he cared. After she left, I stood by the window a long time. I didn't know what street he took home. I didn't know if the kitten had made it. But I couldn't stop picturing his small hands wrapped around that tiny life, trying to protect something no one else wanted. That night, for the first time in months, I turned on the porch light. It was nearly dark when I heard the knock. Soft at first. Then again, 2 quick taps, like someone unsure if they should be there at all. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and opened the door. He stood there soaked from the knees down, sneakers dripping on the welcome mat. His hair clung to his forehead. His cheeks were pale, but his eyes held something I hadn't seen in a long time. He didn't say my name. He didn't say hello. He just looked down and opened the towel in his arms. A kitten. Tiny, shaking fur, matted and wet. Its ears twitched against the cold. It was Shivering, Jonah said, voice thin. I couldn't leave it. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. He swallowed. Mom said to throw it away. She said it was gross, that it probably has fleas. But I didn't know where else to go. He looked up, finally meeting my gaze. Can you keep it? Just for now? I stepped aside and opened the door fully. He walked in without hesitation, still holding the kitten tight to his chest. I closed the door behind him and turned the heat up without a word. He sat on the floor in front of the fireplace while I got an old towel from the bathroom. We dried the kitten together, me holding the towel while he gently pressed its body dry. He didn't ask for food, didn't ask to stay. Once the kitten stopped shivering, he handed it to me like he was passing over something sacred. I can't bring it home, he said quietly, but maybe you can keep it safe. I nodded and tucked the kitten into a basket lined with one of Jonah's old baby blankets. He didn't seem to notice. He lingered at the door for a second, then stepped back out into the evening. I watched him walk until he turned the corner and disappeared. Inside, the kitten let out a tiny meow. I turned the porch light on again and left it glowing all night. The kitten, thin, trembling, with a crooked little tail, devoured every bit of tuna I laid out. Not slowly, not politely. Just wild, frantic bites like it hadn't eaten in days. I sat nearby on the rug holding the towel I'd used to dry it off. It was one of Jonah's old baby towels, soft from years of washing, faded blue with tiny ducks along the edge. He hadn't recognized it when I handed it to him. Or maybe he had and chose not to say. He didn't stay long that day. Once the kitten was fed and wrapped snug in the towel, he stood without looking at me directly. Thanks, he mumbled. It was the first time I'd heard gratitude in his voice since he was 6. But it came without weight, like it was afraid to land. No hug, no question, no pause. He opened the door and left, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. I followed to the threshold just in time to see his shoes disappear into the fog. There were no promises, no mention of coming back. But I stood there for another full minute, holding the door open just enough to let in the night air. Then I closed it gently and turned to the small basket in the corner. The kitten had already curled into a ball, breathing steady now. I watched it for a moment and then whispered, "Pickle, that's what I'll call you." It didn't react, just twitched in sleep. I folded another blanket over the basket and went to the kitchen, put the kettle on. sat at the table and listened to the hum of something quiet returning to life. That night, I left the porch light on again, just in case. And the next afternoon, I added a clean bowl of water by the basket. Not for the kitten, but for whoever might follow. He came the next day. And the next. Never with a bag or a reason. He just knocked once and stepped in like there was no time to explain. I stopped asking why. He always went straight to the basket, scooped Pickle up, and sat beside the heater, letting the kitten purr against his chest, while his backpack sat untouched by the door. He didn't talk much, just stayed long enough to make sure Pickle was fed and warm. Then he'd leave sometimes with a quick nod, sometimes not even that. One afternoon, I peeled an apple and placed the slices on a small plate. I didn't say a word, just set them on the table near him. He looked at the plate, picked up a slice, and took a bite, then another. He finished 3 before he even realized his hand was reaching for more. He didn't meet my eyes, but he didn't leave either. It was quiet for a while. I kept sewing in the chair across the room, pretending not to notice him staring at the curtains. Then he asked, "Why don't you ever visit our house?" I looked up. I was told not to. He nodded, slow and unsure. "Mom says your place is dirty, that you smell like old things." My hands stilled over the hem of a sleeve. I looked at him carefully. "Do you think I smell bad?" He kept his eyes on the kitten in his lap. Shook his head. "No," he said. "Smells like soup. And thread." I turned back to my sewing and stitched the rest of the cuff without speaking, but something in my chest loosened just slightly. Before he left that day, he placed Pickle gently into the basket and tucked the edge of the blanket around her like he'd done it 100 times. I watched from the doorway as he walked down the path and disappeared behind the fence. The next day, he came with something in his hand, a shirt, one button missing. He didn't knock that day. Just opened the door a crack, peeked inside, and stepped through like he always had the right. In his hands, he held a shirt, wrinkled, worn. A button dangled halfway down the placket thread, clinging like it knew its time was up. He didn't say anything, just held it out to me. I took it gently and nodded toward the table. He sat down, pulling his chair close, elbows on knees, like he was waiting for something more important than a button to be fixed. I brought out the sewing tin, the same one he used to rattle like a tambourine when he was little. I didn't mention that, just placed it between us and opened the lid. "Want to learn?" I asked. He nodded once. I pulled out a needle and let him choose the thread. He picked a blue just a shade too dark, but I didn't correct him. I let him watch as I licked the end and slid it through slowly. He leaned forward, quiet, his face close to mine. "Now you try," I said, handing it over. His fingers trembled a little, but he got it on the second try. I showed him how to tie the knot, and he tried that too. It wasn't perfect, but it held. I guided his hands for the first few stitches. Then I let go. He didn't talk, didn't joke, just concentrated. Focused like this tiny, ordinary task was holding together more than just a shirt. When he finished, I snipped the end and handed it back to him. He looked at it for a second, then smiled. Small, honest. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that's just grateful something stayed in place. "Thanks," he said, eyes still on the shirt. Any time I answered, he folded it, tucked it under his arm, and stood to go. But before he reached the door, he turned back. "I think I'll come tomorrow too," he said. And then he was gone. 3 days later, he didn't come at all. Tuesday came and went. No knock, no Jonah. I told myself he was busy. Maybe a test at school, maybe practice. I left the porch light on anyway. Wednesday passed. Still nothing. I refolded the towel in Pickle's basket twice, then sat by the window longer than I should have. By Thursday afternoon, Pickle had started pacing near the door. Her small cries grew louder with every passing hour. She scratched at the wood, once then sat and stared, as if waiting for a shadow that never arrived. Friday evening, just as I was pouring tea, there was a knock. I opened the door and there he was. His cheeks were red, not from the cold, but from tears. His eyes were swollen, his shoulders small, under the weight of something heavier than any child should carry. "I'm sorry," he whispered before I could speak. "Mom said if I came back here again, she'd get rid of Pickle." He looked past me, and his face softened when he spotted the kitten asleep in her basket, one paw tucked under her chin. I just needed to know he's okay. I didn't ask questions. I didn't tell him I'd been waiting. I just stepped forward and opened my arms. He leaned into me slow at first. Not for warmth, not out of habit. He rested his forehead against my chest, like he was trying to hold himself together, like he needed to borrow steadiness just to stand. I wrapped both arms around him and kept us still. We stood like that for a while, long enough for the porch light to click on automatically, long enough for Pickle to stir and let out one small, familiar mew. He didn't say anything else that night, just gave the kitten one last look, then pulled away and walked down the path with his hood up. I watched until he disappeared behind the fence again. The next morning I made a phone call I'd been putting off for years. The next morning I called Nadine at the shelter. We hadn't spoken in a while, but she remembered me right away. I told her about the kitten, and without asking too many questions, she said, "Bring him in. We'll get everything in order." By that afternoon, Pickle had her shots a clean bill of health and a paper in my name. I tucked it into the drawer with Jonah's old drawings and closed it with care. On Sunday, Nolan showed up at my door. He didn't knock, just opened the screen and stood there like he had something to prove. "You're poisoning him against his mother," he said. I didn't flinch. "No," I replied. "I'm showing him he's safe somewhere." He blinked like he didn't expect an answer. Then he turned and left without another word. That evening, Jonah came back. No kitten in his arms this time. Just a book and a granola bar. He sat down at the table like it was normal, like there hadn't been weeks of silence and warnings between us. I made tea. He asked if Pickle still liked the string toy. I nodded. He stayed longer that day. He laughed once when Pickle got her paw stuck in a slipper. It was the kind of laugh that starts slow and surprises you. We played a short card game, the kind I used to keep in the drawer just in case. He didn't win, but he didn't pout either. The next afternoon, he came again. And the one after that. He started leaving things behind, small ones at first. A drawing, a comic book. Then his toothbrush tucked quietly behind the soap dish. He still didn't talk much about his parents. I didn't ask. I just made space. And slowly the house started to sound different again. There was music, laughter, the creak of the old floorboards above the heater where he liked to sit. That Friday, he looked at me across the table and asked, "Do you think Pickle misses me when I'm gone?" I smiled and said, "I think she counts the minutes." Spring arrived in quiet ways. The trees along the fence pushed out soft green tips. The porch light clicked on later each evening. And Jonah came, more often, never rushed, never questioned. He brought drawings folded in fourths, covered in pencil lines, and stories he didn't quite finish. He brought socks and left them under the heater, pretending it was by accident. One day I found his toothbrush beside mine. He didn't say anything about it and I didn't move it. Pickle grew stronger, heavier, bolder. She liked to nap in Jonah's lap, one paw draped lazily across his arm, as if claiming him. Sometimes I'd catch him humming to her, while he read aloud, his voice still soft, but no longer guarded. One evening, I made stew, and didn't ask if he'd stay. He sat down without waiting for permission, his legs swinging from the chair like he had always belonged there. He held Pickle in one arm, while using the other to reach for my hand. "Can I still call this home?" he asked. I didn't answer with words. I just squeezed his hand and didn't let go. He smiled. Not the small one I'd grown used to, but something brighter. He finished his bowl and asked for seconds. Later that night, when I tucked Pickle into her basket, Jonah did the same with the extra blanket. I'll be back tomorrow, he said over his shoulder already, halfway to the door. I didn't ask if he'd cleared it with anyone. I didn't need to, because this time he wasn't coming out of fear or guilt or defiance. He was coming because he wanted to, and I would be waiting, just like always.